Yamaraj, he speaks about the 12 Mahajans, 12 great souls who we should follow. We should follow their example. And Bali Maharaj is one of these Mahajans. It said, Mahajano Yena Gata Sapanta, that we should follow these Mahajans. This is how God reveals the true path, the true principles of religion. He reveals it through his devotee. And so whenever there's an incarnation of God in this world, the devotees surrounding that incarnation who surrender show us the way, show us what true religion is, and the path for us is to follow them, follow the devotee. So how do we follow Bali Maharaj? He's a Mahajan, and this is the path for us to follow these examples. What do we learn from Bali Maharaj? Well, it comes out very clearly in this chapter, in this section. One of the things we're meant to follow when we hear this story of Bali and hear of his example. And one thing Bali Maharaj teaches us is how to suffer. This is something we can learn from Bali Maharaj, because we all have to suffer in different ways, right? Even sometimes cheerful people try to assure us that they don't suffer, but all of us suffer. And one of the keys to spiritual advancement is how to suffer. We have to go through it. How to go through it in a Krishna conscious way. What does it mean to go through suffering in a Krishna conscious way? Prabhupada says here in the purport, in adversity, everyone laments and becomes aggrieved. This is how we normally suffer. And we're not talking about just natural occurrences, the death of a loved one. There's natural suffering. More speaking about our overall attitude in the face of suffering, when suffering comes. What is our overall attitude to our suffering? Sometimes, and we have to observe ourselves, it's different for each of us. But what's going on while I'm going through some kind of suffering? What's my attitude to it? In the mode of tamas and tamagun, there's this lamenting, this deep lamentation. And if we look closely, often it's mixed with pitying ourselves. I don't deserve this. Look what I have to go through. I'm so unfortunate. Look what I have to go through. I don't deserve it, but it's happening. I'm so unfortunate. This is the influence of tamas, tamagun. And when suffering comes if one is in the mode of passion or the mode of passion is predominant, then there's great anger. There's anger. There's resentment. It's not fair. It's not fair that this happens. And we become angry. And we may also then blame others or attack others in some way. If you notice, both of those two examples are complaining that it's not fair. That this suffering that's coming is not fair. So right there we see the ignorance. We talk so much about karma, but actually we see much of it is intellectual. Because if we look at what's happening in our emotions when some difficulty comes into our life, in the emotions we feel this is unfair. So even though intellectually we know, oh, this is my karma, but the emotion that becomes angry and wants to blame others or attack, or the emotion that gets into self-pity, this shouldn't be, look what happens to me, look what's happening in my life. And we see that in the emotions, we don't accept karma. We do in the head. And we're meant to also eventually, from hearing from hearing and understanding, and by the grace of the Lord, it can go from just an intellectual understanding, it can start to actually show up in our hearts, where we actually feel the reality of it. So ignorance, passion, and then in sattva-gun, and suffering comes, and you're in sattva-gun. How do we respond? Well, we can take responsibility for it. We can practice things like positive thinking, or we could think, oh, this is a lesson from life. I'm going to use it to my advantage. And in this way, kind of have a positive attitude, positive thinking. Try to see the meaning, try to see the lesson in life, and improve ourselves. So none of these reactions understand the deeper significance of the suffering. All three, whether ignorance, passion, goodness, they're all reactions of the false ego. They're all false ego responses, right? Because you see that in each of these responses, even when you just try to understand the lessons of life and positive thinking, this doesn't diminish the false ego and the false ego's power in our lives. We're just trying to improve our personalities. It doesn't diminish the false ego. We just become an improved, healthy false ego. So the false ego is left intact with all of these responses. And in fact, we nourish it and we perpetuate it by these responses. Self-pity, anger, improve myself. The false ego lives on in those different ways because it's the modes of nature, material modes of nature. And it is not transcendent. So the reaction to suffering we have to bring in the transcendent understanding. Mm-hmm. So what is that? It's mentioned here in the purport by Prabhupada. He says, by the grace of the Lord, a devotee, even in the worst condition, can understand that he is going through a severe examination by the personality of Godhead. So first of all, this is the understanding that we need to have. By the grace of the Lord, a devotee, even in the worst condition, can understand that he is going through a severe examination by the personality of Godhead. What was the examination that Bali was going through? Prabhupada says a normal person could not even live through it. It was unbearable. Just listen to Bali Maharaj, what he was actually going through. And then when we hear this, we're going to wonder, how was he able to go through this? Because everything at once went wrong, right? It says, although bereft of his riches, fallen from his original position, defeated and arrested by his enemies, rebuked and deserted by his relatives and friends, although suffering the pain of being bound, and although rebuked and cursed by his spiritual master, Bali Maharaj remained fixed in his vow. That's on all levels, right? The suffering is on all levels. Emotional, disgraced, humiliated, the pain, the embarrassment from his position, losing all of his wealth, his possessions, is deserted by relatives and family. So Prabhupada says, an average person could not even live through this. But he took it rightly, and he understood it. And what was it that he understood when this was happening? It's that he understood that God is trying to not just humble me, but remove this wall of the false ego, so that my real self, once the wall comes down, then the real self is behind it. So God is doing this to me. He's trying to break up my false ego so that my real self, the Atma, which is a servant of Krishna, can emerge and live again. So we can observe ourselves when suffering comes. You can see how we play this game with ourselves, and the false ego stays alive, pitying myself, blaming others, getting angry, getting resentful. And we do it. We have to. It's going to go. I'm not saying just don't do it. You can't not do it. It's happening in the emotions. But observe that this is not solving anything. Just observe how it's the false ego. It's like we're playing a game with ourselves. See that, at least understand that, and actually, and understand that actually God has given me this understanding. He's given me this understanding to get a glimpse, to see how the false ego works and operates. And I'm not going to pretend like I don't want to play this game anymore. I want to see the truth. I want to see that this is God's hand in my life for a very intentional purpose. He's bringing this to me. And that is to have me want, to have the desire, to long, to let go of the false ego. And we can't do that without God's grace. But at least we want to see it, and we want to be willing to go through whatever is necessary for our true natures to come through, to emerge. So then, okay, that's a way of understanding suffering when it comes to us. But what do I do when suffering's there? And it's actually very simple. We just have to endure it, because the reactions are coming from the false ego, right? So by just enduring it, by just feeling it as you go through it, understanding that this is Krishna and he wants the false ego to die, and therefore it will feel a little bit like that for us, but it's the false ego. The pain is from the false ego. So to realize the pain that we're going through is actually coming from the false ego. So then what do? Just go through it, understanding that Krishna is doing this out of mercy. So I endure it, tador viva sahishnuna, that one should be forbearing like a tree, right? In the midst of suffering, let me go through it. Krishna will help me. If I'm willing to endure it, Krishna will help me. Tanadapi sunichina, let me become very humble going through this. Let me be patient with it. So there's the understanding of what's happening. It's actually Krishna doing this, because out of mercy, he wants to remove this false ego, which is like a wall between me and him, the real me. And Krishna's now, through this experience I'm going through, he's confronting that enemy within my own heart. So what is that false ego? It's very interesting. There's a description given in the Vedic literature that ahankar, if you could imagine a lake, and the lake has so many particles of dust floating all over the surface of the lake. So that lake is our field of consciousness called the chitta. And all of those particles are samskars that we have. Not just from this life. That lake is filled with all kinds of impressions, samskars, from so many previous lives. In fact, all of them are recorded. So just imagine on that lake, there is the reflection of the moon. And that moon is just, it lights up the lake in just one little spot, right? So the whole lake is the chitta, the consciousness, and all samskars everywhere. But the moon is lighting up just one little circle, one little spot. And the particles that are within that little spot, those are our present samskars in this one life. That is the ahankar, that is the false ego, just that moon reflection in the lake of the consciousness, which is filled with samskars. So that means the false ego is a very limited view of oneself. It's only your present samskars that, oh, I'm from this place, this is my background, this is my ethnicity, my identification. This is what I like, this is what I don't like. That is such a small piece of the whole consciousness, which is filled with samskars. All the other samskars are not active right now because this is where the identification is. This one body, this one life. And that is the ahankar, that reflection of the moon on the lake. Just one little small area. So it's a very small, it's almost like the consciousness is like an ocean, and this one life, this one personality that I'm identified with is one wave that comes and goes. And that is the false ego. The false ego identifies with this one little spot. And all the other samskars are there, but they're not active, they're dormant. So when we have that image, just think about that. When that image comes before us, we see how impossible it is to overcome the situation we're in. It's good to see how impossible it is, because we can't do it anyway. So we start to desire for Krishna to help us. We beg for Krishna's mercy, for Krishna's involvement in our lives, and we see things and how they're operating, and we long for Krishna to enter in and to change us. Otherwise, imagine all those samskars. It's not that we have to see each one and take them out and change everything, but we have to see the engine behind it all. What is the engine behind it all that created that whole situation, that whole lake filled with all those samskars? What has generated that? It's, again, what's generating the false ego even? It's the three things. Karta means I'm the doer. Gyata means I know. To think that I'm the doer is illusory. You know how it works with the samskars. Samskars are there within us, impressions from the past, and they come up into our mind at a certain point, and then we make a decision, and we do something, and that's daiva, that's our destiny coming to us. We think we're freely making those decisions. There is such a strong illusion of freedom. We think all day long, I'm just choosing this, choosing that. But we're trying to decide, what should I do in this situation? Then suddenly what happens, a samskar comes up, I'll do this. And we think it's my free will choosing it. But actually, it's a samskar coming up into the consciousness. And then I have to act on it. And then when I act on it, that creates more samskars, more impressions that go back in to the lake, another samskar, and this is my nature. So it's like a loop, it's like a loop. I have this nature that's already there, that's already programmed, all the impressions from the past. Those impressions come up suddenly, I act on them. Those create more impressions, they come back into this nature that I've created, and it's a loop. It goes on around and around and around. And we're totally entrapped. So to think I'm the doer, that's a great illusion. To think I'm the knower, gyata, which means I'm the knower, that's also an illusion that we know anything. We have to hear, we have to be enlightened by one who knows, Tatvadarshi. And the other one, Bhokta, I'm the enjoyer. So Karta, Gyata, and Bhokta. This is what's generating the whole problem. I'm the doer, I'm the knower, I'm the enjoyer. So with these things up against us, we cannot do much, but it's revealed here. The key. In the next purport, we'll see the statement by Prabhupada. It says, the Supreme Lord not only tested Bali, but also gave him the strength to endure such adversity. So when we think, how am I going to do this? And I really see what's going on, the prison that I'm in. And when suffering comes into my life, and even my reactions seem to be programmed, and how am I going to get out of this? Well, it says here, the Supreme Lord not only tested Bali, but also gave him the strength to endure such adversity. So all we have to do when suffering comes, we understand what's happening, right? Bali understood what was happening. Therefore, it says here, Namuyati. Namuyati means that he was not bewildered by what was happening, even though it was very intense. He could understand what was happening. And what was happening? He understood this is providence. He says, this is Krishna doing this to me. And then what do we have to do? We just have to let it happen. We just have to let the suffering happen. Be willing to endure it. Be willing to let the false ego die. And when it's happening, you can say, yes, yes, thank you, Krishna. I see what you're doing. It is very difficult, but I'll be willing to endure it. In that attitude, then Krishna gets involved. He will help you. When you're willing to endure it, then he'll give you the strength to endure it. If you're not willing to endure it, then Krishna doesn't. We haven't made a decision yet. And I want to read one. This, of course, is a famous verse from the Bhagavatam. Same idea, same theme. This famous verse, 10th canto, Tatenu Kampam Shushamikshimano. So again, this is while one goes through suffering, what is the attitude? What is the consciousness? Because one of the keys to our spiritual advancement is how to suffer. If we suffer in the right way, we'll make great spiritual advancement. And this is how to suffer. Not that we're seeking suffering, but it comes. And then we should know how to respond, because certain responses just keep the false ego intact and don't help us. So the suffering becomes useless. It's not all suffering is purifying. Only when you have the right understanding of what's happening and the right attitude, then it's purifying. It may kill off some karma, but we'll produce that karma again, because again, there's a loop going on here. So this verse says, my dear Lord, one who earnestly waits for you to bestow your causeless mercy upon him, all the while patiently suffering the reactions of his past misdeeds, in offering you respectful obeisances with his heart, words, and body, is surely eligible for liberation, for it has become his rightful claim. And one section of this purport, you have to listen very carefully. This is so good, and this will give us the attitude that we should be in as difficulties come, as adversities come into our life. And if we can hold on to this understanding and attitude, then we'll experience Krishna in the midst of great difficulty. So that's the purpose of suffering. Prabhupada says here, the purpose of the entire creation of God is to rectify the living entity's tendency to enjoy without the Lord. And therefore, the particular punishment given for a sinful activity is specifically designed to curtail the mentality that produced the activity. The very specific difficulties that come to you are very perfectly, meticulously designed for you to curtail what? The mentality that produced the activity, the sinful activity. And don't just think, oh, the mentality, I thought this and this reaction. It's this overall, this strong, this ego, the false ego. That's what's meant to be curtailed and diminished. So we'll continue. Although a devotee has surrendered to the Lord's devotional service, until he is completely perfect in Krishna consciousness, he may maintain a slight inclination to enjoy the false happiness of this world. The Lord therefore creates a particular situation to eradicate this remaining enjoying spirit. So Krishna wants to through suffering, Krishna wants to take away this desire, this selfishness, the false ego to enjoy separately, to enjoy my way, to do it my way. That's what Krishna wants to deal with when difficulties come into our life, these reactions come. This unhappiness suffered by a sincere devotee is not technically a karmic reaction. It is rather the Lord's special mercy for inducing his devotee to completely let go of the material world. And to let go of the material world means to let go of material consciousness, so that he may return home back to Godhead. A little more. This is the purport to, if you want to read this on your own, 10:14:8. So I'll just finish the purport. A sincere devotee earnestly desires to go back to the Lord's abode. Therefore, he willingly accepts the Lord's merciful punishment and continues offering respects and obeisances to the Lord with his heart, words, and body. And we're all thinking the same thing. How? It's too difficult. And that's the point. Just the willingness to see the truth of what's happening. This is Krishna removing my false ego. That's why this is happening. Out of mercy. Krishna is my friend doing this. And I'm going to be willing to endure it with that understanding. He willingly accepts the Lord's merciful punishment and continues offering respects and obeisances to the Lord with his heart, words, and body. Such a bona fide servant of the Lord, considering all hardship a small price to pay for gaining the personal association of the Lord, certainly becomes a legitimate son of God, as indicated here by the words Dayabak. And this is the last sentence. Just as one cannot approach the sun without becoming fire, one cannot approach the supreme pure Lord Krishna without undergoing a rigid purificatory process, which may appear like suffering, but which is in fact a curative treatment administered by the personal hand of the Lord. Wow, so good. It's a strong medicine, I think, for some of us, but there's a certain simplicity to it as well, right? I'm going through a certain suffering in my life. Okay, this is Krishna's personal hand, and the pain that's there, it's the pain of the false ego, the suffering I'm going through. It's because the false ego wants to live. It wants to react. It wants to blame. It wants to get angry. It wants to pity itself. So let me not do any of that, but let me just endure the pain and feeling it, understanding it as a purification. Let me go through it. I'm not denying it either. I'm going through it, with the right understanding and with that desire in the heart. We're offering obeisances to the Lord while this is happening, because we know the friend in my heart wants me to return. So we allow for that struggle to take place within me. That Krishna is trying to have my false ego die. Yes, let it happen. I'll go through it. So that my true self can be utilized fully in his service. Right? If you need to build something, you have to knock something down first. If certain buildings, sometimes we see they're going to put up a new building, but there's an old structure there, and you have to blow it up. And then when it's all cleared, then something new can be built. So this is what Krishna is doing. So when in the daily sufferings, it's hard to get into this consciousness, right? So we're just distracted and we react, but then keep catching yourself. Oh, this is a reaction of the false ego. What's really happening here? Let me take a moment. And if there's suffering I have to go through, then I'll be willing to endure it. Krishna will help me. So I wanted to speak on this theme because Bali Maharaj is the most extreme example of this principle, when everything was taken away and he suffered on every level. This is how he saw it. The mercy of providence, he calls it. And when Prahlad appears after Bali Maharaj says that, and Prahlad appears with tears in his eyes when he sees the Lord standing there, because he's also feeling such gratitude that the Lord has done this to Bali. And when Bali sees Prahlad, he also cries. But this is a kind of an understanding between them that, yes, this was very humbling, this was very difficult, but how merciful is the Lord that he brought this about in my life, because now I'm in my purified state. He took down what was artificial, what was false, what was contaminating, the false ego. Right? So it's like Bali and Prahlad had this understanding between each other, and they both understand how to suffer. Suffering will come. We don't seek it. It comes automatic. And then how to go through it so that we make spiritual advancement and don't just suffer uselessly. Because mostly it's useless suffering. Even if it's the ending of certain karma, it's still useless because more karma will be generated because of our attitude, because of the false ego. So it just comes and goes. But finally, when one understands that this is the Lord coming to me through this experience, and I just have to be willing to endure it, and he will help. And I can pray to him in my heart and offer my respects, understanding that he's a friend doing this and not my enemy. I don't resent him. I don't resent what I have to go through. It's Krishna, the friend, appearing to bring me back to his lotus feet. So I'll end here. There's a few minutes left if anybody has any thoughts.
Yes,
comments,
Prabhu.
questions.
I'm not racing.
Whoa, that was fast. Yeah. All right, my old friend.
So, yeah, I have a couple of things. One is, we are, as you said, we are to not resent suffering when it comes. We are to willingly endure it for the sake of our purification. So how to do that and simultaneously take steps to counteract suffering. You know, in other words, when are we being complacent, and when are we tolerating?
Yeah, it's a good question, Gail. We can always try to counteract whatever's happening. It's not that we just do that naturally. It's like, but sometimes suffering comes that can't be counteracted. Certain feelings that are going on in the emotions on that level, and you just kind of go through it. In other words, people think, well, people seek other ways of counteracting that can sometimes be unhealthy and make things worse, like drugs or something like that. That's also trying to deal with it. So there comes a point where we want to, like, as a devotee, so long we're not getting into such heavy things like that, we want to create a situation that somehow maybe relieves us, but we also should know that whatever is contained in this whole experience has to be gone through with the right understanding. And so, you can counteract what you can. We do our best. We shouldn't get obsessed also with counteracting, because in a certain way, that false ego. You see, if everything's protected in the wrong way, and we find all these like unhealthy ways of escaping, then that false ego just lives on, because there is a kind of process, there's like a dying that needs to take place. And it's the dying of the false ego. What was that, Gail?
No. You said you used the word dying. At first, I didn't understand the word.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking that I'm thinking of like Parikshit Maharaj, right? Or let's say somebody who is diagnosed with cancer. I think I know what the answer is going to be, but I can say, you know what? I've been diagnosed with cancer. I'm just going to accept this as Krishna's mercy in the mood of Parikshit Maharaj, and whereas I guess it's depending on a person's level of detachment.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Something like that has to be very, like a natural realization from within. In other words, okay, I'm older now. I just got diagnosed with cancer. It's going to be a long, hard road, and everyone's telling me that I should do chemotherapy and all these things. But you know what? Being a devotee and maybe having that understanding that I'm just going to let this be. And I can do that. We have to check in with ourselves. Okay, I'm going to say maybe that's a good idea. Can I actually do it? Do I really see that I'd rather choose this quality? I'd rather, just like I work for hospice, right? So a lot of people make that decision at some point. Okay, I've tried so many aggressive treatments. I'm done with that. Now I just want quality over a quantity of life. So one's own, but say you get cancer young or something, then you do what you can, right? We try our best to figure things out, and then we'll see if that works.
But
that gives some relief.
Even that young person, why should he try? In the spirit,
it's our duty, it's our duty in this material world that we have these bodies, and just like you get up in the morning and we take care of our bodies, we shower, we brush our teeth. It's a kind of way of, we have to make an effort. We have a certain situation that we're in, it's been ordained by God that I've come in this way, and it's very natural and part of our duty to take care of ourselves the best we can. And then sometimes
that's my problem. I'm trying to reconcile doing our duty with this, that verse 10:14:8. Just tolerating, as Krishna's way of trying to kill our false ego. Even at a young age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there are different kinds of, say you're in your body's giving you pain, say there's just physical pain, you have a toothache. And so it would be foolish to think, I'm just going to tolerate this, and just go through it. It's Krishna purifying me. You go do what's necessary. But there are times when different kinds of suffering come into our heart, where there's like a deeper suffering, more existential, maybe on the emotional level as well, where there's nothing you can do about it. So you don't have to seek out and wonder. How about those times when you just can't do anything about it? Maybe that's when we just need to practice enduring, accepting it, and seeing it as Krishna. So that's maybe a good way to start, is when you can't do anything about it. Practice there, and then you'll get realization in other situations in life. From your realization, you make different decisions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you distinguish it like that, the things that you can do something about, you do something about, and the things that you don't see any way around it, that's where you apply 10-14-8.
Yeah, that's a good way to start, and because I think that's something we all experience as well. Things we just, a certain suffering comes, we just have to kind of go through it, but seeing it in the right way. There's nothing we can really do about it. It's something kind of going on inside of us. And then other things when making decisions with life. I mean, that's according to realization. But I think those realizations will come when we take the other suffering that's unavoidable in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I just squeeze in one quick one?
Yeah.
I'm lying. I know it's not quick. The false ego, mainly it wants to be the enjoyer, it wants to be the knower, and it wants to be the doer. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this knower part? Because superficially, there doesn't seem to be anything so wrong with wanting to know stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not clear on this knower part.
Well, the false ego meaning that I do know. I do know already. I have knowledge. I've been educated. I went to university. Therefore, I know. I know what is what. I know what this life is. That's a kind of illusion. That's an illusion. No matter how educated we become, it's to not see what's truly going on, as we hear from the Bhagavatam, the full picture. So it's like accumulating more knowledge in the mind, and then we start to feel a certain that I understand things. I know how it works. I live my life. We don't, but to realize I don't know. Wow, if I don't know, really, I know some things in life. I can pick up, I can learn certain things. But if I don't really know what's most essential, and I have to admit that I don't know how to be happy, I don't know how to overcome suffering, and that I don't know is very good for us, because then we'll be open and eager and longing to hear. And Krishna can provide that intelligence from within.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm just one tiny comment is that all throughout your lecture, I had the recollection of the Kaliya serpent pastime where every time Krishna is stomping on one of the hoods, it's like he's trying to eradicate the false ego.
Yeah, that's a good story connected to this point.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you so much for your realizations. I, as usual, always love them. Hare Krishna.
So much. Like this topic of using this all-pervading reality of suffering as a tool to turn to Krishna. It's almost like it's like an yoga of suffering. What you spoke, it's like how to use this suffering to go close to Krishna. So it's a practical topic, and I pray and hope like you can take this in and then live by that. So thank you so much for especially illuminating on this topic, which is so real, and it's just the everyday reality.
Thank you, Prabhu. I saw there was one comment or question about the difference between guilt and taking responsibility. So, with guilt, it's like, again, we're playing a game with ourselves. It's the false ego playing a game with itself, and I'm so guilty, and we kind of get into that. And again, that's another false ego reaction. But the difference is that the taking responsibility simply sees where one is going wrong, and it just observes it, where you're not so angry or upset with yourself, because you know that, yes, I'm a fallen being. I've turned to, I just observe and just see, and you just get that information that, oh, this is what I'm doing. You just see how strong the enjoying tendency is within me, and you just clearly see it, and then you want to seek a solution so you don't go into that hole, that painful hole of guilt, which is like I'm so bad, I'm so bad, I'm so bad. But it's a kind of clarity of just seeing. One doesn't get paralyzed. So in other words, if the person who feels this deep guilt and shame, they're not truly accepting what's happening. They're resisting it, and that's why there's that struggle, that pain of guilt, because they're resisting the fact that they're fallen beings. That's why it's so painful. That's why it's such a struggle, and there's so much guilt. It's like, no, I don't want to be fallen, but look what I have to go through, and look what I do wrong, and it's like so. But then the sober consciousness, the deer, the one who has a kind of sobriety, oh yes, I am. And those are stages. So sometimes we just have to go through a certain guilt and the pain of it. But then at some point, when we do wrong or we make mistakes, it doesn't destroy us. We just say, well, there I go again. Krishna, please help me. Now let me take deeper shelter of the process of devotional service. Let me chant with more attention. So we just immediately get into the idea of rectifying and not just entering into that hole of the emotions which just drag us down, bring us down further. So that, I don't know if that helps. That's something I wanted to just show a little distinction there, just so that we don't think. And there is a real guilt, and there's like a pseudo guilt, a false guilt. And the real guilt is, there will be real guilt felt at some point too. That's in relation with Krishna, and there's a certain, it's clean, even though it's the feeling of guilt.
Hi, Krishna Prabhu. If you have time, there is a request for another question.
Yeah, I have a little time. Maybe one more.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna. This is not fully in line with like the overarching theme of this class, but when you were speaking about Bali Maharaj and his struggles, you mentioned how even his spiritual master turned away from him and rejected him. And like at that point, my heart jumped because I was just like, well, hold on a second. Isn't it that the spiritual master always stays with the devotee until they go back to Godhead? And I know that my understanding is incomplete, and so I really would like to hear on that point.
Yes, Bali's spiritual master was a spiritual master in name only. So if you look closely at the story and read this is from the, I think, 20th chapter of the 8th canto, but you start to see that, Bali Maharaj his spiritual master was basically telling him not to surrender to God. His spiritual master, Bali was so wealthy and powerful. And so his spiritual master was attached to that wealth. And he knew that if Bali surrenders to God, then God will take away all these things from his life. And so he became fearful that, well, if he takes away these things from my disciple's life, then what will I have? Who will take care of me? And so the motive of the spiritual master, so he wasn't a true spiritual master. And Bali Maharaj began to understand this. And so Bali Maharaj, once he understood that his spiritual master was advising him not to surrender to God because of the fear was that something like this would happen, that Bali would lose everything, he'd be humiliated, he'd go through suffering. And so his spiritual master was somehow saying, don't do that to yourself. Protect yourself. Protect me. So Bali started to understand that this is not a real spiritual master. He was a spiritual master just in name only. And so he was given that intelligence from within by Krishna. And then he rejected his spiritual master. And then Bali Maharaj, then the Sukracharya, the spiritual master, then as a response to that being rejected, he cursed and rejected Bali. And so it still was painful for Bali because there was still a relationship. So you can kind of see, you can read in the verses that there is still a kind of pain because there was a relationship, but he also understood that this is not a true spiritual master. So Bali rejected, and then Sukracharya, the spiritual master, rejected in response and cursed him.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So you're right with your understanding of the spiritual master and the eternal relationship. But the point is, this wasn't a spiritual master, even though he was called as such.